College football nerds here talking Alabama and Florida. Huge game, obviously. We predicted both of these teams to win their respective divisions in the SEC this year, so no need for a victory lap. Y'all know we're good at what we do. I want to remind you, please, in the comment section, give us your score. Since you're already liked and subscribed, even those Florida fans who are mad at us when we picked them to not beat Georgia, and they beat Georgia and proved us wrong. Josh, I don't want to talk a whole lot about the LSU game. It was what it was. I said on Twitter earlier today, the unfortunate thing about that situation was had Florida played LSU when the game was originally scheduled, I think they beat them by 3 touchdowns. I think they were completely checked out of this game. Alabama was the same in the first quarter against Arkansas. They knew what was ahead of them and just weren't really in it. That doesn't excuse the loss, but the one thing that we've seen this year from Florida is a really good offense, and specifically a really good passing offense. And we've talked about how that scales better and is more efficient than the run game in college football or football in general. And I want to talk about their offense as it relates to Alabama's defense, because one of the things we've seen recently is since the Ole Miss game in the first half of Georgia, Alabama has really looked good, at least in the box score with the defensive production. Are you concerned a little bit about the thing we talked about last week, that they have also followed that up with a lot of games after Georgia where they didn't play good offenses? Are you at all concerned? Is there a corner of your mind that says, if I'm an Alabama fan, this Florida offense is the first offense since we were giving up points earlier in the season that could really challenge a good defense and might show us that Alabama's defense isn't quite as good as we've gotten comfortable with the last few games?
Realistically, I think you have to at least consider it. I do think Alabama's gotten a lot better. They were busting coverages and making defensive mistakes early in the season, sort of no matter who they played. And that was causing them to give up points and third downs at a rate that didn't quite make sense. But the point I had made, and it actually kind of intended it more as a positive early in the season, was, hey, you open with Texas A&M, Ole Miss, and Georgia, and you had a lot of other teams like Arkansas or Auburn that didn't have as hard a slate to start the year. Maybe they played Georgia, for example, Auburn early, but they didn't play A&M, of course, till much later, and Ole Miss until later. That made a lot of teams look better statistically and made Alabama look worse. And what I think we've seen a lot in nationally and in the conference is your defensive statistics mostly resemble the offenses you've played. We've kind of been on that train for a while because we do this percentage of opponent averages allowed. And Alabama's allowing 80% of opponent rush averages, about 85% of opponent passing averages. Those numbers are actually really good. I mean, anything below 90% in passing, and you're doing well. So getting it down to 85 is good. Elite defenses can get that number into the 70s, and that's about as much as we ever see. You can do a lot better against the run. You can get that number even sub 60%. Alabama's 2016 defense did that. But I think part of Alabama's problem is the teams they play only average 3.2 yards a carry. So it's hard to really distinguish yourself. And that's the game in both ways, right? That no one ever really holds teams they play well below their average on average. I mean, you have games where you show out on defense and you'll shut somebody down, but then you'll have games where you sort of sputter and people overreact one way or another to both times. It's more about trying to get teams to something about like 80% of their production. If you're doing that, you're playing really good defense. And if you're pulling them to way less than that, either you're generational. And if you're shutting teams down a lot of times, you'll find that the teams you're playing maybe aren't necessarily all that good. So suffice to say, I would be a little concerned that a lot of what's happened with Alabama has been a product of who they played. But I can also tell you statistics were in the 90s plus early in the season, and they've dropped all the way down to the 80s. They've been more like a 75% rush, 80% pass team, which is really good the past 5 or 6 weeks. The one thing I would say if you're an Alabama fan, if you take a step back and say, okay, so with Mississippi State, you played Costello for most of the game. Kentucky, you played whoever Kentucky tried it out at different points. Auburn, you played Bo Nix. LSU, you played Finley and most of the game, and Johnson a little bit, not Brennan. Arkansas, you played a very gimpy Franks, and then they rotated in Jefferson. He got hurt, and they put Franks back in. You haven't played the better quarterback for most of these teams. I mean, Rogers has been the best at Mississippi State. Kentucky, I don't know who the best guy they have is, but there's really no good option. Arkansas, though, you didn't play a full health Franks. LSU, you didn't play Brennan. So I think there's a little bit there to that, but I will say, even from a statistical sense, they've done better. The thing that really makes me curious about this game is Trask, more than anything, represents someone who has the ability to effectively run an offense, the ability to effectively run a scheme, check the ball down, and exploit the sort of mental errors we'd seen from Alabama early in the year. And with that whole discussion of quarterbacks, the thing that you really ought to keep in mind with all of them, none of the guys I named have a strong grasp of an offense or a strong grasp of how to effectively distribute the football. I think that's where Florida has the most to gain versus those teams and maybe can exploit something other teams don't. Because regardless of the talent level, which is its own question, the biggest issue Alabama's had isn't been really man-on-man. It's about running the scheme properly, not being caught out of position. That's something Florida's good at this year, and that's something that Trask is good at identifying. So even if Trask isn't necessarily that much better of an overall talent than Felipe Franks, who he's a better player, but I'm not sure he's a better talent. The reason he's a better player is he's much better at running an offense.
I will say it's interesting on the flip side of that. If you're an Alabama fan, it's almost exciting to see if your defense can effectively shut down a top offense, and I don't think they will. I kind of tip my hand there a little bit. I don't think they're going to shut down Florida's offense. I don't think anybody will. I don't think in modern college football you're shutting down any good offense, and I don't think you have to be mad about that. I want to turn this back around just 30 seconds on this. Like, if you're an Alabama fan, are you equally as excited to see what your defense will look like against a top offense, so you don't have a lot of these question marks going into the playoffs of whether or not you can actually, at least slow down a good offense?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. It's just sort of seeing how things pan out, how the team looks, have they improved, and how much does it translate when they're in a game situation where teams are stressing them schematically. I do think Alabama's gotten a lot better and experience has gotten there. And this is one thing I'll say for both teams coming into the SEC championship. When you look at the Ohio States and, the Pac teams of the world, there's a pretty big difference between what the SEC teams look like in week 10 and week 11 right now and what some of the other teams look like that are only really in their fifth or sixth game. And I think that shows for a team like Alabama that was really talented early in the year, well, a lot like LSU last year, is playing far better football just because defense is so predicated on not screwing up first. And then once you your ability to not screw up allows you to become really good by then making the big play. And if you screw up, it will negate 4 big plays or 4 big plays from the defensive side of the ball.
I also think that there's something to be said here about the type of, everybody wants to say that the type of offense that gives Alabama a lot of trouble is the running quarterback, which I think that we've beaten that to death, where it's not the running quarterback. It's a Heisman level quarterback who's also mobile, but really the mobile thing just happened to be that the good quarterbacks they faced, the good Heisman winning quarterbacks they faced, were also mobile. But it was the pass game that they were good at. The flip side of that, though, is you also have to have a good running game complement to really stress Alabama. What we saw from Ole Miss earlier this year was, yes, Corral was making some really good throws, but the run game was there. 2 really good running backs that were pounding them up the middle that kept them on their heels. And that's something that I don't see Florida having. So if we're talking about the potential for this game to possibly go sideways for one of these two teams, it probably is going to be Florida. And in my mind, and tell me if you agree, it will be their inability to run the ball will make them not nearly as effective against this defense passing the ball, which could in turn spell a lot of trouble for Florida.
That Ole Miss game is an interesting stat point in that regard because people remember it as a high scoring game and think of it as being very explosive. Ole Miss ran the ball 57 times and Corral only passed it 28. They were 2-1 run to pass against Alabama. And I don't think people remember it that way. But it really was Connor and Ely averaging both over 6 yards per carry. I think that made that game what it was. And yeah, Corral had a 13 yard per attempt average, which is really, really good. But I don't think he has that if they weren't having so much success running the ball. And they had a lot of crucial third down conversions doing so. I thought it was interesting against LSU because Florida did run it well, or at least Malik Davis in particular ran it well. Now, a lot of their yardage, which ended up coming out, it's kind of funny. Malik Davis was 11.6 or about 12 yards per carry. Tony had a couple end rounds, ended up 19 yards per carry. And then the team ended up at 5. And the reason for that is there were so many sacks, and Dameon Pierce was largely ineffective in the game. I do think, though, by and large for Florida, there has been a general inability to run the ball. Looking throughout the year, 4.2 yard per carry team, that's serviceable. I already established the SEC is actually averaging under 4 yards per carry on average. But, like the Tennessee game, it was 31-19 in large part because they had 1.1 yard per carry. And they've had 4 to 5 yards per carry lately. But if you look back the Georgia game, even though that was a blowout, it was only 2.6 yards per carry. A&M held them to 3.7. South Carolina held them to 3.3. There's lots of reasons to think Florida can be held on the ground. And I think the problem that presents itself, and this is what you saw in the LSU game, and I'm curious if you agree with me on this. My take from LSU playing Florida was that LSU said, you know what, we're going to kind of give you the run. We're going to play too high safety the entire game. We're going to drop our linebackers almost the entire game. We're going to give you the run because we think correctly you're going to get 5-6 yards per carry doing that. But I'd much rather give you 5 to 6 yards per carry and occasionally get a negative play than, get killed throwing the ball. And sure enough, pinning their ears back and playing pure pass defense, they get Trask on the ground for a loss, 7 times in the game, I think. And then they give up, again, like 81 yards on just 7 carries to Malik Davis, but it's not enough to move the needle because Florida is 2-1 pass to run. They throw the ball 47 times, they only ran it with their backs only about 18 times. So you can afford to get gashed occasionally that way. And the thing I noticed with Florida earlier, I put it out on Twitter. The two of us discussed it. When you watch Tennessee and some of the other games, in Tennessee in particular, they kept getting number 33, which was a linebacker lined up on Tony in the slot. And the reason for that is a lot of it had to do with Pitts, which we'll get into in a minute. But teams sort of treated Florida using their base defense, and they treated Pitts in particular as a tight end, not a receiver. If you try to go single high, where you've got either you're too high and you've got a linebacker on a slot, where you try to go single high and then man up the corners and then try to play with a normal box, you really can't defend Florida. And the thing that Tennessee did around the time I tweeted actually is they went basically a set smaller than you normally do. So when Florida was in a 3-wide look, they were actually playing dime defense. And when Florida was in a 2-wide look, they were playing nickel. And that let them play a corner on Pitts, which was the biggest part of it. But it let them either play a corner on Pitts, or before, if they wanted a quarter on Pitts, they had to have single high safety. And I think if you play Florida light the whole game and you accept that you're going to give up the run, but you keep 2 safeties over the top and you keep a defensive back on Pitts, I think that's the recipe for handling Florida, because I think LSU did this a lot. I mean, they did do this a lot. I don't think they were terribly comfortable in that LSU game throwing too high. And without Pitts, they didn't have the way to create that schematic headache for defenses, and it kind of snowballed on them a little bit.
Yeah, and there's 2 things here. One, for Alabama, if Alabama fans watch the Arkansas game, they'll see that Arkansas did something similar, where they were not necessarily conceding the run game as much as they were conceding underneath passes. And I think it's smart when you're outmanned to do this, because you're not going to shut them down entirely. And it's just the hope that, you limit the explosive plays. Because for a lot of these big time offenses, and Auburn is an example of this when they're really good, they're so much better scoring from outside the red zone than in, that if you play them straight up, then you are going to give up a number of those over the top scores. Where I think what LSU is doing, and a lot of teams are doing to modern offenses, is saying, okay, we're going to give you in between the 20s. We're going to give it to you. And however long it takes you to do it, which is also another thing that helps LSU in this case, is it shortens the game. We're going to give you the in between the 20s, and then we're going to try to make it hard as possible for you to score, because all of your touchdowns are going to have to come from a shortened field. And, it's going to be even tougher. You get first and go on the 10. You got to go 10 yards in a compressed field, and it's a lot harder because it really locks down your playbook and limits your options. Arkansas did that, but the difference between Florida and Alabama, I think, is that Alabama can actually run the ball. I think Trask can take what a defense is giving them underneath all day long just as well as Mac Jones. I don't think there's anything special there that Mac Jones has that Trask doesn't have. But I do think the difference, and you've talked about this a lot, is running teams are so much better in the red zone, and that's where you have a hard time limiting. Because if you're going to give them all the yardage up to the 20s, and then Najee Harris is going to go ham on you, like it is you're going to die either way. And with Florida, I don't think you are, because they can't run the ball that well. The second part of this, though, which I want you to talk to a little bit, is Alabama usually defends straight up. They don't put a special guy on a special wide receiver. We've seen this year with Patrick Surtain has not been following the best receiver all over the field. They don't do that. They generally don't drop, they don't go into special packages either. They play a base nickel. They're a 3-4 team that plays a base nickel all the time. And they do use their linebackers a lot in coverage. So two things here. One, do you think because Pitts is flexed out or blocking, like he's such a weapon and such a wild card, that they will change their strategy? And two, if Christian Harris doesn't play or isn't 100%, does that also change your strategy, and we might see a lot more dime look from Alabama where otherwise we wouldn't have in this game?
I really think you hit on two good points there. The first is what I was saying earlier. The reality in defending Florida is that you need to treat Pitts as a receiver. Pitts is a competent blocker. I think he's good enough to be used as a blocker inline. He's not an exceptional inline blocker. It's not a huge fault. That's not what teams are looking for. That's not what makes him special. It's not what the NFL really cares about. And I saw a lot of teams earlier, though, try to play him as a tight end because they're afraid that you get an unbalanced line, and if you're a nickel, you're getting to run over. If you're good enough defensively, you don't need to do that. And we've talked at length over and over, and Alabama fans have heard it a million times, about the 2018 Clemson game and what they did and why they won that game. And a lot of it was they played a weakened box between the 20s the entire game because they said, we're not going to let Tua beat us deep. And they played an extra guy in coverage more than they needed pretty much the entire game. And it was Simmons they were able to walk out because he was kind of a hybrid linebacker safety, and they floated him in those RPO slant sets, and they never gave that up. You can't do that really well with a true linebacker because they just can't get back there fast enough, and if they're at the line of scrimmage, they can't drop. If they're back, they can't get to the line. So the easiest way to do it is to have an actual safety on the field. Now, the thing that Alabama has an advantage with is they've got the talent to do it. The problem for Tennessee in that game, Alontae Taylor was banged up. They had some other guys get banged up at corner. They didn't really have a fourth corner. And they didn't really have a linebacker that could cover. So teams didn't really have one option or the other. I thought with LSU that was the thing that was going to crack, and that was the thing that was going to cause LSU to lose the game when they had the injuries that they did. But the guys they put in, none of them were exceptional, but they were all serviceable. And as much as their secondary has been maligned, they actually had better, like, the drop-off from 2 to 5 wasn't really that great. None of the guys were particularly good, but they had a whole bunch of guys that were all kind of similar quality, so they could put a whole bunch of them on the field. They were average across the board, but they weren't hugely deficient the way like Tennessee was when they had an extra linebacker at corner. Alabama can go full dime with no problem. Alabama has guys like Helms and Branch that are these 4 or 5-star guys that are not starting on their defense, but have played a lot this year. And they are more than happy to go dime. And they have guys that are the sort of athlete that can absolutely play the run and the pass. They're physical enough to do both. And they got Malachi Moore has been a big shining spot for them in the slot, and he's really disruptive. I think Alabama's going to play this game with Pitts as if he's a receiver at all times. And even when Florida goes in line, I think you're going to see Alabama with an extra corner essentially on him. And they may blitz the corner or do something fancy with the safety. And they may give up a little more run than people are anticipating. But Alabama's depth allows them to do that. And especially like you said, if Christian Harris is banged up, if you go dime, you're going to take a lineman or a linebacker off the field. They can go 4 down because they're a 3-4 nominally, but the fourth linebacker always has his hand in the dirt. Go 4 down, you get Allen and Anderson are their usual outside rushers on the field at the same time. Moses is generally the play caller, who's been good but has not been the same as he has been. I think some Alabama fans get really upset with him, but he hasn't really done much wrong. He's just not quite the elite player they were hoping for. But anyway, you take Harris off, and it kind of solves every problem all at once. So I do expect Alabama to play this game pretty much exclusively nickel dime, and I expect them to play a lot more dime than they have at any point this year. And like you said, that might actually negate any of the issues they may have with Harris being injured.
And the thing is, I think that Florida fans and Alabama fans can appreciate where, because they've experienced success in many generations of football that are recent, they can appreciate the fact that it used to be coming into a game like this, thinking that if you know the other team is going to score 24, 28 points, you're really concerned. Because that's how college football used to be just 10 years ago. Now, you have an offense that says, if you're telling me we're going to give up 28 points Saturday, I can guarantee you we're going to win. I can 100% guarantee it, because that means our defense has done an excellent job against a great offense, and we're going to get ours. I want you to talk about all of what we've said up until this point. Does it really matter, given that Alabama is 100% going to score in the 40s regardless? Because where we have question marks about Alabama's defense, whether or not they're as good as they've shown, we know Florida's defense has some real concerns. So I want you to talk about whether or not that matters and kind of show us what the model says while talking about it.
The reality for football, as we said a couple times in this video, is that offensively, you're in an advantage. The RPO scheme breaks the way defenses work. Safeties cannot key off the line of scrimmage like they used to. You can't key off a lineman blocking or releasing, so you don't know if they're in pass pro or run, and the safeties have to sit there flat-footed. You don't have that. Breaks the ability for the defense to crash the line of scrimmage or drop properly like they're supposed to. And because they can't do that, it's changed the way defenses have to operate. And I think that's something people don't understand. It's not just a matter of, oh, now you can get fooled. It's no. Gus Malzahn just got fired. Why did he become a success and get fired? It's because when he started, defenses playing college football were built around the idea that you read the offensive line. You looked if the guard was releasing downfield because it meant it was a run, or if he was staying put. And the defensive schemes were built off those keys, and that's how defense reacted. Malzahn feasted on that. And when he started doing some RPO stuff and pop plays and the pop pass and the kick six game, it was all based off the fact that the defense was using those keys. What's happened due to that is that defenses changed the way they keyed. They don't do that anymore. Not just don't get caught. They don't use those keys anymore. And now they kind of have to sit and read and react. So defenses are generally slow. They're reactionary. They look kind of crappy. It's the same sort of thing that happens in the Big 12, only the SEC can actually tackle and has decent-sized athletes. But the reality is you can't really ever play defense as well in this system. And you have to run it, because if you don't against the RPO, you're going to get destroyed. And we see that with like Maryland early this year. I think it was like the Penn State game that they were trying to do things they're not supposed to do. They get annihilated. You can't play the RPO scheme and run those old keys. But the new keys that do work against the RPO and these new concepts aren't great. So the effect of the RPO really isn't so much that it itself is the explosive thing anymore. It's that running the RPO changes the way the defense has to play, and the defenses now in this era, playing the style that they have to play to be competent, can never really hold a good team under 30 points. And that's Alabama. So turning to the model, we really haven't probably given enough credit to Alabama on this show, in large part because Alabama has been so good that it hasn't been as interesting. And most of their games have been non-competitive, as many as we've covered. Alabama's averaging 11 yards per attempt and 5 yards per carry. That's about a yard better than Florida in both categories. They've done that despite the fact that, they haven't really needed to, and they've had a lot of garbage time that's hurt their numbers. We don't filter all that out for various reasons. A lot of it is really technical, and there'll be a day when we have a better data set, and we'll do that. But when you pair that to the defense that Alabama has versus what Florida has, it's pretty substantial. Alabama, again, 86%. Florida's at 92% rush average, 97% pass. So you kind of get yours passing the ball. 97% of SEC averages this year. Numbers are all a little worse because there's no easy games thrown in. And then 92% against the run. We say that a good defense can usually hold you below your rush average, so that's actually pretty darn average themselves. So if Alabama's able to just get theirs, to have their average day that they've had over the course of the season, you're looking at an 8-yard per play team. And 8 yards per play is 40 points or more every time. Now, this model has it about 7.8 yards per play for Alabama, about 6.4 to Florida, because they are a very good offense. And it has the margin actually only 48 to 43. But this is the last point I'll say before I kind of turn it back to Daniel to talk about the number. I don't necessarily buy the number here. I think the yardage differential is important. I think a lot of these concepts are important. I don't think the model number quite makes sense. And the reason for that is, look at Alabama's recent games. The Auburn game, how many points did they score? They're in the 40s. How many points did they score in Arkansas? 52 points. Mississippi State was 41 points. They could have done about whatever they wanted at the end of all those games. So what our model is seeing is, their ceiling's around 50. And that's why it's putting the 48 number out there. I don't think their ceiling is 50. I think their ceiling is a good bit higher. There is a limiter that our self-trained model will create if your offense stops itself because your defense is stuffing them enough that you don't need to keep scoring. Alabama, if they want to, can really outpace the production they've shown. The first half of LSU was a good example of that. The danger for Florida in this game is they could put up 40 points in this game, be down 10 to 13 at the half, and lose by 20. That's why the line is, I think at last count, about 17 points. It's just incredibly difficult because I think Alabama is actually more than capable of putting up 50 to 60 points, even on Florida. And even with good defensive play, your reality, if you're Florida, is you're going to probably need to score minimum 40 points. I'm going to say minimum 40. And realistically, you may need to score in the 50s to be able to win this game because of where Alabama's at offensively. And I just don't know that Florida can hit 50 points, which is what the model is saying they really probably need to do.
Yeah, and I think that it's a good point because, I said before, I think Florida's going to score some points. I think like the LSU game we saw, even Ole Miss is a good example where when Alabama needs a touchdown, they go get a touchdown. Georgia was the only game this year where they slowed down a little bit and they still scored 41 points. And that was a healthy Georgia. And I know Florida fans don't want to hear this, but they played a different Georgia defense than Alabama played. The other point in this is if Florida keeps scoring, they are going to keep giving the ball back to Alabama, which in talking about the overall score, not necessarily who wins or who loses. I think this is going to be similar to 2018 Alabama-Oklahoma. And then Alabama's playing a good offense that might get a little off track early but find their groove later. And Alabama just is consistently scoring from the jump, and that's the difference in the game. One thought I have is that Florida does have a good enough offense to actually shorten the game if they want to, in that they can consistently get first downs and convert some of that to points, where Kentucky tried to just sit on the ball and snap it at 2 every time and get 3 yards every play. Florida's got a good enough offense that they can throttle back, throttle down, throttle up where they need to in relation to how the game is going. The problem is, I think Alabama's going to be able to score at will, and this is not a shot at Florida. I don't think their defense is very good. I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's very good, and Alabama can score at will on good defenses. So my score for this one is a little tighter than maybe the commentary would indicate, 42-24. But I think part of that is just because Florida's offense is that good that there's going to be some yardage in there that maybe isn't converted into points. Maybe 30-ish points worth of yardage from Florida, worth of drives from Florida. And that's going to shorten the game enough that Alabama only gets 42, but it's because that's what they need to win. And I think what we're going to see, like that Oklahoma game, is anytime Florida does score to make it a little uncomfortable for Alabama, they're just going to go out and grab another touchdown. And I could be wrong, and Florida fans were yet again not picking your team to win. But right now, there's not a lot of Florida fans that are picking their team to win. That's not to say they can't win. It's just to say that right now, the data doesn't support it. Give me your score.
I'm going to say 51-31, which is a very high-scoring game, but I do agree with the 2018 Oklahoma analogy. I think Florida is going to score in this game. I think Pitts, in particular, presents matchup problems. He's the same sort of impact that Waddle is in terms of his ability to really control the way the defense operates. I talked a lot about linebackers and safeties and nickel and dime, but I want to give a concrete example. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. Something Florida likes to do, watching the game, they'll go, a 2 or 3 wide set. So we'll say 3 wide receivers in the field. And what they'll do is they'll have 3 wide receivers in Pitts. And they won't go 1 wide receiver on one side and 2 on the other. What they'll do is they'll take Pitts and they'll put him wide on one side of the field. And they'll put all 3 receivers on the other side. And the challenge for defenses when they do that is if you don't have 4 corners on the field, where does the linebacker or safety cover? Traditionally, if Pitts is the wide guy on one side, he gets a corner because the wide split man on the side is going to get a corner, and then and then maybe like your boundary corner, field quarter, whatever, and then you're going to have the corner on the other side on the furthest guy, and then maybe your nickel guy covers next guy out, and the slot is usually the linebacker or safety. That's where they like to put Tony. The problem, as good as Tony was in the last game, the problem for Florida is without Pitts on the field, LSU didn't quite have the problem of we can't possibly leave Pitts out there on a linebacker one-on-one isolated on one side. Alabama has to deal with that. And so that lets them put Tony in a more manageable situation, and now you've got this conflict. It's the same thing Waddle did with Smith. So I think Florida's going to get theirs. That's a hard problem to stop. But the matchup on the other side, I think, and the reason Alabama can keep pace, people are going to look at Devontae Smith, and I think Smith can be successful, but you can bracket him, which Arkansas did most of the game against Alabama and gave up chunks underneath. The problem for Florida, and I've said this for about 4 years now on this show, the linebacking core is not particularly talented. Miller at linebacker is solid. He gets a lot of tackles. That's great and wonderful. He's not high-end. Ventrell Miller is not a high-end NFL draft pick by any means. There's some talk like you could get Jeremiah Moon back in this game potentially. Reese is more than likely out, so you're kind of beat up. The talent level wasn't necessarily there. Now on the edges, they're pretty good. I'm not arguing that. Brenton Cox is a good player, but the guys particularly dropping back in coverage aren't great. And I think somewhere that Alabama can really exploit, like you're talking about, both these teams are probably going to let you move the ball between the 20s. Don't expect a ton of 3 and outs, or at least I'll be surprised if that happens. It's not the smart way to play football against these teams. You're going to let them get stuff between the 20s. But Alabama has the ability to exploit Florida because they now have a tight end in Billingsley, and they've got a lot of depth at receiver that they haven't really had to use. And I think we're going to see Alabama really attack that linebacking core from Florida because whereas the defense as a whole has not been great, the linebacking core in particular is very average, in my opinion. And that short stuff negates Florida's pass rush, which actually is pretty good. And if they can keep that, they're going to move down the field pretty efficiently. I think the biggest danger for Florida is that Florida, when they score, may score fast. Alabama may be able to be a lot more controlled in their movement down the field. And the time of possession, which I don't care about time, I really care about play count. The play count between these two teams offensively could get pretty out of hand by the end of the game. I could see Alabama moving the ball pretty well and consistently, and then Florida scoring in chunks. And I think the game this is more similar to is maybe the Alabama-Georgia game, where it's kind of close and it breaks. And the reason that it just kind of breaks open is Florida could end up being really, really exhausted by the end of this game. And I think the ability of Alabama has to run and to play the short game and move the sticks very efficiently in a way that Florida, I'm not sure can or can consistently get first downs that way, may mean that this game gets tilted. And by the third or fourth quarter, it becomes really untenable for Florida to actually stop Alabama on any given drives. Whereas Alabama, like on their defensive line, they may not be necessarily elite this year at any given guy. They've got a crazy amount of depth all across the board defensively. They've got a linebacker that started last week, didn't miss a beat. They've got reserve corners. They've got probably 3 deep defensive line. They're not going to get tired. And I think it's the third, fourth quarter depth issue, which has not really been a thing Alabama's had to deal with. I think that's actually the thing that gives them the biggest edge in this game.
So we've run super, super long on this. I don't want to go too much more. I got one question for you to round this out, and then we can shut it down. Even 2018, where Alabama was considered, people were talking about the best team of all time, and there was a lot of hype, we did have some concerns. And we had some real concerns after I think it was Christian Miller that got hurt in the Oklahoma game, given the defensive woes that they had, especially with pass rush. Give me the number defensively that if Alabama holds Florida to this score, whatever the score is, that you start to think that nobody's going to touch them in the playoffs. Is there a number, and where does that feel? Like, what number do you see Sunday morning? And again, Florida fans, I'm not saying this is going to happen. This is just hypothetical. But if Alabama can hold Florida to X amount of points, what is that point number that really opens your eyes Sunday morning? You're like, whoa, man, Alabama might just walk.
I think I put that number, it's about your score prediction, but it's really under 24. I think 24 is the mark. If Alabama's holding them under 24, or if, let's say, they score the 24th point in garbage time, with time expiring or on Alabama's backups, yeah, I'm kind of alarmed. I think a team like Florida should be able to score in the 20s. But if it's like 21-42, I'm really alarmed if Florida only scores 21 points. And it's partly
alarmed in a good way for Alabama.
Yeah, alarmed for everyone playing Alabama. Because the reality at this point, and we do our top 10, it's not even close between Alabama and other teams. We talked about this in the top 10 video. What was it? It was like the gap in, and I'll pull it up right now. Alabama leads in a lot of statistics. So this is net yards per play. That's the yards per play given up defensively, the yards per play gained offensively. Alabama is technically second in the country to BYU. Throw BYU out. It really is trash competition. Whatever you think of BYU that throws these kind of statistics out, like really screws it up. But the gap between Alabama and Florida, Florida's actually the next best in the country, is 3.66 to 2.37. Alabama is 50% better than the next best team in the country in Florida. And that gap between Alabama and Florida is
the same gap between Florida and Tulsa.
Who's
in the 20s.
Yeah. Who's 26th. So it's basically Alabama to the number 2 team, Florida, is the same as Florida to the number 25 team in Tulsa. That's the kind of margin Alabama is actually operating out statistically. It's just silly and stupid, and it's not even worth debate on who's the best team right now. From a statistical perspective, it's Alabama, and it's laughably not close.
All right, that's it for this one. Let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be, and we will get at you in those comments. We've got a lot of other content coming out this week. Obviously, a lot of big games. We also, I think, are going to touch on Ohio State and why we think they should be in the playoffs. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging out with this really long preview. Y'all have a great one, and God bless.